What happens when a wife walks into her husband's office on Valentine's Day with flowers in her hands, only to find the entire office congratulating him on getting engaged to another woman? Not a rumor. Not something hidden behind closed doors, but a public celebration where the husband stands smiling under the applause of coworkers, while the woman he is still married to realizes she is the only person who was never told her marriage had already been replaced. People often say, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. But when the truth shows up in a moment that humiliating, should a person quietly walk away or let the consequences of that betrayal change everything? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. And now, let's hear her out. Valentine's Day in San Francisco always carries a strange kind of optimism. The city feels softer. Somehow, restaurants packed with couples, florists doing brisk business on every corner, people rushing home early with wrapped boxes and bouquets tucked under their arms. That afternoon, I was one of them. My name is Calatrix Voss Arden. I'm 41 years old, and for nearly 17 years, I had been married to Rowan Arden. To most people, Rowan was the impressive one. He was the strategic director at Redbridge Dynamics, a rising technology firm headquartered in the gleaming Pacific Crest Tower downtown. He was charismatic, confident, and ambitious, the kind of man people naturally assumed would end up running the entire company one day. And me. To the outside world, I was simply Rowan's quiet wife, a woman who worked in investment, a woman who preferred privacy over attention. I had always allowed people to believe that. That afternoon, I stood in the elevator of Pacific Crest Tower holding a bouquet of deep red roses and a slim envelope tucked inside my purse. Inside the envelope were 2 business-class tickets from San Francisco to Paris, departing later that evening. I had also made reservations at Maison Bellecour, a French restaurant Rowan and I once talked about visiting during a trip we never took. For the past year, our lives had slowly drifted into separate lanes. Rowan buried himself in corporate strategy meetings and investor dinners. I immersed myself in my own work. Somewhere between schedules and obligations, the small rituals of our marriage had faded. The Paris trip was my way of changing that. I wanted to remind him who we used to be. The elevator doors opened on the 37th floor. Redbridge Dynamics occupied the entire level. A wide-open office stretched out in front of me, glass walls, polished concrete floors, rows of sleek desks glowing with computer monitors. But the moment I stepped out, something felt wrong. 2 employees who had been talking near the break area suddenly stopped mid-sentence. One of them glanced at me, then quickly looked away like a child caught doing something they shouldn't. A young receptionist behind the front desk stared at me with wide eyes, not surprised, almost alarmed. I gave her a polite smile. "Hi, I'm here to see Rowan." She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite form the words. "Of course," she said finally. As I walked deeper into the office, I felt the weight of attention following me. Conversations lowered to whispers. Someone quickly slid their phone into their pocket. Another person glanced toward a large conference room across the floor. The door to that conference room opened. Rowan stepped out first. He was wearing the same navy suit I'd seen him leave the house in that morning. His expression looked lighter than usual, almost triumphant. And standing beside him was Dr. Serafina Kessler. Serafina was the CEO of Redbridge Dynamics, a woman with a reputation that moved through Silicon Valley like a sharp wind, brilliant, ruthless, unstoppable. Behind them, employees began gathering near the conference room. Then someone clapped. Another voice rang out across the room. "Congratulations on the engagement." The words hung in the air like a bell. For a moment, my mind refused to process them. Engagement? My eyes drifted to Rowan's hand. A diamond ring gleamed there under the bright office lights. Before I could fully understand what I was seeing, Serafina turned toward him. With a confident smile, she slid one arm around his waist and kissed him, right there in the middle of the office. A cheer went up around them. Serafina lifted her hand and displayed her own ring, larger, brighter, impossible to ignore. The room erupted with applause, like they were witnessing the announcement of a royal engagement. And that was the moment everything clicked into place. They weren't joking. They weren't rehearsing something. They were celebrating an engagement, while I was still his wife. Rowan's eyes finally found me. The transformation on his face happened in seconds. The smile vanished. His shoulders stiffened. The confidence drained away, replaced by something that looked very much like panic. Calatrix Serafina followed his gaze. When she realized who I was, her expression didn't show embarrassment. She didn't step away from Rowan. Instead, her grip on his arm tightened slightly, as if silently declaring ownership. The entire office fell quiet. I could feel dozens of eyes watching me, waiting for a scene, for anger, for tears. But none of that came. I looked at Rowan, then at the diamond ring on his hand, and finally at Serafina standing beside him. "Congratulations," I said calmly. The word echoed strangely in the quiet room. I walked over to a nearby desk and gently placed the bouquet of roses on its surface. The red petals looked almost theatrical under the office lighting. Then I turned around. No shouting, no accusations. I walked toward the elevator. Behind me, I heard Rowan call my name once more. His voice strained, but I didn't stop. The elevator doors slid open as if they had been waiting for me. I stepped inside. And as the doors closed, sealing me away from the stunned faces outside, I pulled out my phone. The first thing I canceled was the Paris flight. 2 taps on the airline app. Refund confirmed. Next came the reservation at Maison Bellecour. Canceled. Then I opened our shared credit card account. Within seconds, I froze the card completely. My reflection stared back at me from the polished steel walls of the elevator. I didn't look devastated. I looked focused. Because in that moment, I realized something important. I hadn't just walked away from an awkward scene. I had just walked away from an entire life Rowan believed he controlled, and I was about to start dismantling it piece by piece. By the time I pulled out of the underground garage of Pacific Crest Tower, the late afternoon traffic of San Francisco had thickened into its usual slow river of headlights and impatient drivers. My hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. What surprised me most was how steady I felt. No shaking, no tears, just a sharp, crystal-clear sense of direction. Shock had lasted maybe 5 minutes. After that, my mind shifted into the same mode it always used when facing a complex problem: identify the variables, determine the strategy, execute. Because the truth was, Rowan never really understood who he was married to. To him, I was a private investor who preferred staying out of the spotlight. Someone who managed a handful of portfolios and occasionally attended finance conferences. He knew I was successful, but he had no idea how successful. I wasn't just an investor. I was the founder and controlling shareholder of Helios Meridian Holdings, a fintech investment firm that quietly held major stakes in several emerging technology companies across California. My ownership share alone was 83%. The personal value of that share was roughly $557 million. I had kept it that way intentionally. Secrecy had protected me from opportunists, from people who would suddenly see a relationship not as a partnership, but as a transaction. Even Rowan had never asked too many questions. That suited me fine. But there was another detail Rowan never knew. Redbridge Dynamics, the company he worked for, was one of Helios Meridian's strategic investments. We were a primary financial backer in a billion-dollar technology initiative the company had been developing for the past year, and the person who approved that funding, me. At the next red light, I reached for my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Lysander Cole answered on the second ring. Calatrix. Everything okay. Lysander was the CFO of Helios Meridian and one of the few people who knew exactly how much control I held over the company. "I need you to initiate 3 actions immediately," I said. My voice sounded calm even to me. He paused, clearly sensing the seriousness. All right. First, withdraw my 83% stake from every investment structure currently linked to Redbridge Dynamics. Silence. Second, freeze all pending disbursements related to their joint technology project. Another pause. And third, I continued cancel every strategic meeting scheduled with Redbridge until further notice. Lysander exhaled slowly. That's a massive shift. Did something happen financially? No? A red light turned green in front of me. This isn't financial, I said. It's personal. Lysander didn't ask another question. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. Understood. I'll push the directives through internal compliance right now. Thank you. I ended the call and placed the phone back on the console. Within minutes, the orders began moving through Helios Meridian's internal system. Legal teams reviewed the withdrawal. Analysts alerted partner firms. Financial platforms updated their positions. In the world of venture investment, information moved quickly, and money moved even faster. Less than an hour later, the ripple effects began. Investors monitoring Redbridge Dynamics noticed the sudden withdrawal of a major backer. Speculation started almost instantly. By the time I reached the Golden Gate Bridge, financial chat boards were already buzzing. Redbridge's stock dipped sharply. Inside the company, the board of directors began demanding answers from the CEO, from Serafina Kessler. Meanwhile, Rowan Arden's strategic director, newly announced fiancé of that CEO, was still standing somewhere inside Pacific Crest Tower, with no idea why the ground beneath his career had just begun to shake. But he would. Soon, because the first tremor had only just begun. By the time I crossed the Golden Gate Bridge and drove into Marin County, the late afternoon light had turned soft and gray over the water. My house sat high on a quiet hillside overlooking the bay, a place Rowan and I had bought nearly a decade earlier when his career first began accelerating. The long driveway curved through tall cypress trees before opening into the stone courtyard in front of the house. Normally, pulling in there felt peaceful. That afternoon, it felt like arriving at the eye of a storm. The moment I turned off the engine, my phone started vibrating again, and again, and again. I picked it up and stared at the screen. Missed call notifications stacked one on top of another, scrolling so quickly I could barely read them. In just 2 hours, there were 356 missed calls. Rowan's name appeared more than 40 times. Serafina Kessler had called from her personal number at least a dozen times. Several unknown numbers came from Redbridge's board members. A few messages were from corporate attorneys requesting urgent communication. It was almost impressive. For 17 years, Rowan had never called me more than twice in a row. Now he was dialing like a man, watching his entire life collapse in real time. I stepped inside the house, kicked off my heels near the entryway, and set my purse down on the kitchen island. The wide glass windows framed the fading view of the bay, but my attention remained fixed on the glowing screen in my hand. Another call came in. Rowan. For a moment, I considered letting it ring again, but then I answered. Callitrix, thank God. His voice sounded nothing like the man I had seen smiling confidently in the office earlier that afternoon. The smooth certainty was gone. In its place was urgency and something close to panic. "Where are you?" he asked. "At home." There was a brief silence. "Listen what happened today. It isn't what it looked like." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "Is that right?" "It was a corporate announcement," he said quickly. Serafina wanted to build a new leadership narrative for the company. Investors love strong partnerships. We were presenting a vision for the future. I didn't respond immediately. Through the phone, I could hear distant voices in the background, probably still inside the Redbridge office. "Callitrix, say something." "All right," I said calmly. I paused just long enough for him to think I might believe him. Was the kiss also part of the presentation? Rowan didn't answer. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the faint sound of his breathing. "You're overreacting," he said finally, though the confidence behind the words sounded forced. "You walked in during a moment that was meant for internal staff." Rowan. My voice stayed level. An engagement ring is not a PowerPoint slide. Another pause. Then he exhaled sharply, as if deciding to change strategies. Look, you don't understand the bigger picture here, he said. Serafina believes I'm the future of Redbridge. She's been positioning me for the CEO role. There it was. Not love, not confusion, power. She's planning to step back from day-to-day leadership in 2 years, Rowan continued. When that happens, I'll be the natural successor. And marrying her helps that transition, I asked. It stabilizes the leadership narrative, he said quickly. It reassures the board. I closed my eyes briefly. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. Rowan hadn't betrayed me because he fell in love. He had done it because he believed it would move him closer to the top of the corporate ladder. You should have trusted me enough to talk about this, he added. I almost laughed. Talk about what I asked. Your engagement to another woman. It wasn't supposed to happen like that today, he said. The announcement was scheduled internally first. I was going to explain everything to you tonight. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. Finally, I said, You just traded everything you had for a position you don't even hold yet. What does that mean? It means, I said quietly, you've made a very expensive decision. Callie tricks. But I had already ended the call. The house was silent again. Outside, the bay darkened under the approaching evening. I set my phone down on the counter and poured myself a glass of water. Rowan still believed he was in control of the situation. He still believed the only damage done today was emotional. He had no idea that the financial consequences had already begun. And that realization brought a strange calm over me. Because whatever happened next, this was no longer a private argument between a husband and wife. This had become something much larger, and it had only just begun. 3 days passed. During those 3 days, the financial world began reacting exactly as Lysander had predicted. Helios Meridian's withdrawal from Redbridge Dynamics spread quickly through investment networks. Analysts started asking questions. Investors who once felt confident about the company's future suddenly hesitated. By the end of the week, Redbridge's stock had dropped nearly 19%. Financial blogs were already publishing speculation about internal instability within the company's leadership. I watched it all unfold from my office. Rowan, meanwhile, continued sending messages, dozens of them. At first, they were defensive. Then, they became urgent. Finally, they turned desperate. We need to talk. Please call me. Just one meeting. Let me explain. For 2 days, I ignored them. But eventually, I agreed to see him once more. Not because I believed anything he might say, but because I wanted to see how far he was willing to go to defend what he had done. We met at Harborstone Grill on the San Francisco waterfront. Rowan had chosen the location. It wasn't a coincidence. 17 years earlier, he had proposed to me in that same restaurant at a corner table overlooking the bay. The attempt at emotional nostalgia was almost predictable. When I arrived that evening, Rowan was already sitting at the table. He looked different. His suit jacket hung slightly loose on his shoulders, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The polished confidence he once carried like armor had cracked. But the first thing I noticed wasn't his appearance. It was his phone. He kept checking it every few seconds, watching, waiting, monitoring the market. So that was the real source of his anxiety, not the collapse of our marriage, the collapse of his company's stock. Thanks for coming, he said as I sat down. I nodded politely but said nothing. A waiter approached, but Rowan waved him away impatiently. I don't have much time, he said. Things at the office are complicated right now. I can imagine. He leaned forward. Look, what happened at Redbridge the other day wasn't about feelings. It was about strategy. I've heard that explanation already. You didn't hear the full version, he insisted. He began describing how Serafina had been planning a leadership transition within the company. According to him, their public engagement was meant to create stability during that transition. Investors, he claimed, would respond positively to a united leadership image. She believes in me, Rowan said. She thinks I can take Redbridge to the next level, and marrying her helps that process. It strengthens the narrative," he replied. The words sounded rehearsed. I studied his face carefully. Rowan wasn't apologizing. He was defending a business plan. "You didn't answer my question on the phone," I said. "What question?" "When were you planning to tell me?" Rowan hesitated. For a brief moment, his expression revealed the truth. There had never been a plan. "I was going to talk to you soon," he said finally. "Soon," I repeated quietly. He shifted uncomfortably. Then he said something that made everything even clearer. "You'll be fine, Callitrix. You've always been independent. It's not like you rely on my income or anything." I watched him carefully. "So that was your calculation. What do you mean? You assumed the consequences wouldn't matter much to me." He frowned. "Well, you manage a small investment fund, right? You're comfortable. This doesn't have to be a war." For the first time that evening, I almost smiled. Rowan still believed I was just a quiet investor managing modest portfolios. He still had no idea how deeply his company's future was tied to decisions I controlled. I pulled $557 million out of Redbridge's project, I said calmly. For a moment, Rowan simply stared at me. Then he laughed. "Okay, that's not funny. I'm not joking." His laughter faded. "You don't have that kind of authority." "I do." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Rowan's eyes searched my face, looking for any sign that I might be bluffing. When he realized I wasn't, the color slowly drained from his expression. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the investment withdrawal came from you?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair, stunned. For the first time since this entire situation began, Rowan looked truly uncertain, because he was beginning to understand something important. The crisis unfolding inside Redbridge Dynamics wasn't random. It had a source. But even then, Rowan still didn't know the full truth. He still didn't know who he'd been married to all these years. 2 days after my meeting with Rowan at Harborstone Grill, the atmosphere around Redbridge Dynamics had changed noticeably. In Silicon Valley, information traveled quickly, but uncertainty traveled even faster. Helios Meridian's withdrawal from the company had already triggered waves across investment circles. Analysts were discussing it openly. Industry newsletters were questioning whether the company's leadership structure was stable. Several planned technology partnerships were suddenly paused while investors waited to see what would happen next. Redbridge wasn't collapsing yet, but it was bleeding confidence. That Wednesday morning, I arrived at the Helios Meridian headquarters earlier than usual. Our offices occupied the top floors of a modern glass building in downtown San Francisco, far quieter and more controlled than the hectic energy inside a tech startup like Redbridge. My assistant stepped into my office a little after 10. "There's someone here asking to see you," she said. "Do I have an appointment?" "No," she replied, but she insisted it was important. Her name is Leora Chen. The name sounded faintly familiar. After a moment, I nodded. "Send her in." A few minutes later, a woman in her early 30s entered the office. She wore a navy blazer and carried herself with the cautious confidence of someone who worked in corporate environments but wasn't used to being in the spotlight. "Ms. Arden," she said politely, "thank you for seeing me. Please sit." She lowered herself into the chair across from my desk. "I work at Redbridge Dynamics," she explained. "Project Management Division." I studied her expression. She looked nervous, but determined. "What can I help you with, Ms. Chen?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I heard about what happened at the office on Valentine's Day." The room went quiet. "I'm not here to create trouble," she continued carefully. "But after everything that's happening right now, I felt like you deserved to know the truth. About Rowan and Dr. Kessler?" I leaned back slightly. "Go on." Leora clasped her hands together as if organizing her thoughts. "Their relationship didn't start recently," she said. "It's been going on for about 9 months." 9 months. Long before the engagement announcement. She continued, Most of the mid-level staff already knew about it. They didn't exactly hide it during company events. What kind of events? Industry conferences, investor dinners, tech expos? She replied. They arrived together, left together. Everyone noticed. I remained silent while she spoke. Doctor. Kessler talked about it openly with some of the senior managers, Leora added. What did she say? Leora hesitated again. She said Rowan would be leaving his old marriage soon. The phrasing hung heavily in the air. Old marriage? She believed the divorce was already being planned, Leora said quietly. That meant Rowan hadn't just been lying to me. He had been telling an entirely different story to everyone around him. Leora continued, There's something else you should know. I nodded for her to continue. Some of their trips were funded through the company. What kind of trips? Travel labeled as business conferences, she said, or market research meetings. But they weren't business trips. No, she said quietly. Not really. Leora explained that several expense reports had raised quiet concerns among some employees. Flights, hotels, private dinners, costs that looked more like personal vacations than corporate meetings. And they had all been approved through Redbridge's corporate accounts. They weren't even very careful about it, she said. Everyone assumed senior leadership knew. I folded my hands on the desk. Anything else? Leora looked slightly uncomfortable. There's something Rowan used to say, she admitted. What did he say? He told people that your marriage was basically over already. I felt a faint tightening in my chest. He said the relationship only existed on paper. She continued, that you both had separate lives. So that was the version of our marriage he had shared with the world. In that story, I wasn't the betrayed wife. I was the distant, indifferent partner who had quietly faded out of the picture. Leora watched my reaction carefully. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't realize how serious things were until everything started happening this week. I appreciated her honesty. But the truth was the emotional shock had already passed. What remained now was clarity. Rowan hadn't simply made a reckless decision. He had been constructing an entire narrative to justify it, a narrative where I no longer mattered. Leora stood up to leave. Before she reached the door, she turned back toward me. There's one more thing, she said. I looked up. Serafina believes Rowan will choose her, she said. But sometimes I get the feeling he's playing a bigger game than either of you realize. She didn't elaborate, but the comment stayed with me long after she left, because if Rowan had been lying to me, and lying to Serafina, then the situation might be even more complicated than I initially thought. 3 mornings later, I arrived at Helios Meridian just after 9. The building was quiet, the city still settling into its usual weekday rhythm. I walked into my office and set my bag down on the desk. That was when I noticed the envelope. It sat neatly in the center of the polished wood surface. Plain, unmarked. No return address. My assistant stepped in behind me. This came by courier about 20 minutes ago, she said. The delivery instructions said it had to go directly to you. Did the courier say who sent it? No. I picked up the envelope. It was thicker than normal mail. Inside were printed documents, several stacks, emails, text message transcripts, hotel receipts, flight itineraries. I sat down slowly as I began reading. The first set of messages confirmed what Leora had told me. Rowan and Serafina had been communicating privately for months. Their conversations moved easily between professional strategy and personal intimacy. But that wasn't the part that stopped me. Further into the documents, I found messages between Rowan and 2 other women. 2. Both relationships had taken place during the past 2 years. One of the women was a government affairs consultant involved with a technology policy group in Washington. Her work connected closely with regulatory decisions affecting several tech companies, including Redbridge. The implication was clear. Rowan hadn't just pursued personal relationships. He had been using those relationships to expand his influence. Several hotel invoices appeared next, Luxury suites, private dinners, weekend trips to cities that had nothing to do with Redbridge's official schedule, and many of the payments had been charged to our joint household credit card, which meant the financial cost of those affairs had been shared by me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the documents spread across the desk. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a pattern, a strategy, a system of deception built carefully over time. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Calitrix Arden. A familiar voice responded. Hello, Calitrix. Serafina Kessler. I waited. I assume you received the envelope, she said. So you sent it? Yes. There was no hesitation in her voice. Why? Because I recently discovered something interesting, she replied calmly. What would that be? That Rowan wasn't exactly honest with me either. I listened without interrupting. He told me he had already started the process of ending your marriage, she continued. He said the two of you had been living separate lives for years. That must have made things easier for him. Yes, she said, it did. A brief silence passed between us. Then I began hearing rumors, Serafina continued, about other women. Her voice hardened slightly. So I started looking into his travel history. And you found them? Yes. Another pause. When I realized the truth, she said, I thought you deserved to know as well. Her tone wasn't apologetic, but it was honest. I suppose we were both part of his plan, she said quietly. That seems likely. She exhaled slowly. Calitrix. I didn't call to fight with you. I didn't expect you to. Another moment of silence. Finally, Serafina spoke again. He played both of us. The call ended shortly after that. I placed the phone down and looked at the documents spread across my desk. Rowan's situation was no longer just a failing marriage. The network of lies surrounding him was starting to unravel piece by piece, and once that process began, it rarely stopped on its own. That night, after the call with Serafina ended, I stayed in my office long after the rest of the building had emptied. The city lights outside my window flickered across the bay, reflecting off the glass walls of nearby towers. But my attention remained fixed on the stack of documents spread across my desk: emails, flight confirmations, hotel invoices, private messages. For hours, I read through every page. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Rowan had been maintaining several relationships at the same time for nearly 2 years. Serafina was only the most visible one. The others were scattered across conferences, private trips, and business travel that had never actually involved business. Some of the trips were listed as technology summits. Others were described as market research visits. But the hotel reservations told a different story. Luxury suites for 2. Weekend stays in cities where Redbridge had no meetings scheduled. Restaurants booked late at night with no corporate clients present. The details were precise enough to reconstruct entire weekends. Rowan hadn't simply been careless. He had been systematic, and he had used both company resources and our shared household finances to maintain the illusion. When I finally leaned back in my chair, the room was quiet again. There was no anger left in me. Just certainty. I gathered the documents into a neat stack and reached for my phone. Adrian Lockhart answered on the first ring. Adrian had been my attorney for nearly a decade, calm, methodical, and rarely surprised by anything. Good evening, Calitrix, he said. I'm sending you a file tonight, I replied. You'll want to review it carefully. What kind of file evidence? He paused. Understood. I need 2 things prepared. I continued. First, a divorce filing based on marital misconduct and misuse of shared financial accounts. Second, a formal report for the Redbridge Dynamics Board of Directors. What kind of report documentation showing that one of their senior executives has been using company travel budgets for personal relationships? Adrian exhaled slowly. That will cause significant problems for them. Yes, I said calmly. That's the point. I sent the documents within minutes. By the next morning, Adrian's legal team had already begun organizing them. Within 48 hours, the consequences started appearing. 1 week after Helios Meridian withdrew its funding, Redbridge Dynamics entered full crisis mode. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Serafina Kessler was summoned to explain how the company's strategic director had been publicly involved with the CEO, while the company faced major investor instability. The investigation moved quickly. When the board reviewed the evidence regarding Rowan's travel history and financial behavior, the reaction was immediate. Rowan Arden was suspended from his position pending further review. Serafina was temporarily removed from active leadership duties, while the board conducted a formal investigation into company governance. The news reached the financial press almost instantly. Headlines began appearing across technology media outlets. Leadership crisis at Redbridge Dynamics. Questions raised about executive conduct. Stock price falls again amid board investigation. 2 major development projects were quietly canceled as investors pulled back from the company. Confidence continued draining away. 3 nights later, Rowan showed up at my house. It was almost midnight. The doorbell echoed through the quiet hallways as I finished reviewing documents in my study. When I opened the door, he looked like a man who had not slept in days. His normally neat appearance had fallen apart. His shirt collar was open, his hair disheveled, his eyes red with exhaustion. "Cali tricks," he said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I just need 5 minutes," he said finally. I stepped aside and allowed him inside. He walked into the living room and looked around as if the familiar space no longer belonged to him. Everything was still the same. The furniture, the paintings, the quiet view of the bay through the tall windows. But the atmosphere had changed. I lost everything Rowan said quietly. "What happened at Redbridge?" "They suspended me," he said. "The board thinks I violated company ethics policies." He laughed bitterly. "Serafina's under investigation too, and the investors are panicking," he said. "Projects are collapsing." He looked at me carefully. "Cali tricks." "I made a mistake." I waited. I got carried away with the opportunity, he continued. "Serafina promised me a future inside the company. I thought if I played along with her plan, everything would work out. And now it's falling apart." He stepped closer. "I want to fix things between us." I studied his face. "Fix what exactly?" "Our marriage," he said quickly. "We can get past this." "You're serious?" "Yes," he insisted. Serafina was just part of a professional strategy. It wasn't real. I walked over to the table and picked up a folder. Inside were copies of several pages from the envelope. I handed them to him. Rowan looked down. The color drained from his face. One page showed messages between him and another woman. Another contained a hotel invoice from a trip that had nothing to do with Redbridge. He turned the pages slowly, his hands beginning to tremble. You have all of this?" "Yes." The room fell silent. Rowan stared at the documents as if trying to understand how his entire life had been reduced to a stack of printed pages. He finally looked up at me. "You sent this to the board?" "Yes, and the divorce filing." "It's already in progress." For the first time since he arrived, Rowan seemed completely defeated. "I didn't realize things would go this far," he said quietly. "That's the problem," I replied. "You never realized anything." He stood there for a long moment. Then he walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back once more. "You know what's going to happen after this," he said. I didn't answer. "You'll end up alone too," he said. "People like us always do." I watched him walk out into the night. I didn't respond, because the conversation we had just finished was no longer about love. It was about truth, and truth had a way of clearing everything else away. 3 weeks later, the legal process moved faster than most divorces ever did. The evidence Adrian had assembled made the situation straightforward. Rowan didn't contest the filing. Most of the major financial assets were already under my name before the marriage began, which meant there was little he could claim during the settlement. Our shared accounts were closed. The remaining joint property was divided according to the legal agreement. The marriage ended quietly. Meanwhile, the situation at Redbridge Dynamics continued unraveling. The board concluded its investigation within a month. Serafina Kessler was formally dismissed as CEO. The company cited leadership misconduct and violations of internal ethics policies. Rowan Arden's employment contract was terminated shortly afterward. The official statement mentioned reputational damage and misuse of company resources. Both of them disappeared from public attention almost immediately. The technology press moved on to other stories within weeks. Rowan left San Francisco. I heard later that he relocated to another city in search of new work opportunities, though the damage to his professional reputation made rebuilding his career difficult. Several former colleagues quietly distanced themselves from him. Ambition had once opened every door for Rowan. Now those doors were closing. As for me, life returned to a quieter rhythm. Helios Meridian adjusted its investment portfolio after withdrawing from Redbridge. The shift caused some turbulence at first, but it also created new opportunities. Several new projects moved forward more quickly once the capital was redirected. Work filled my days again. Months passed. Then one evening, long after the legal and corporate storms had settled, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Serafina standing outside. She looked different from the woman who once commanded a room full of executives. The confidence was still there, but it was quieter now. "Hello, Calitrix," she said. I stepped aside to let her in. She walked slowly into the living room, glancing around as if taking in the calm atmosphere. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," she said. "So have I." She folded her arms. "Rowan destroyed both of our careers in different ways," she said. "He manipulated both of us." I considered her words carefully. Then I shook my head. "No," I said. She looked surprised. "He didn't destroy my life," I continued. "He only revealed what was already broken." The room fell silent. Serafina nodded slowly. After a few minutes, she stood up to leave. At the door, she paused. "Goodbye, Calitrix. Goodbye." When the door closed behind her, the house returned to its familiar quiet. I walked back into my study and sat down at my desk. For a moment, I looked out across the bay. The past few months had changed many things, but one realization stood out above everything else. The most important part of this story was never about losing something. It was about seeing the truth clearly. And once the truth becomes clear, life has a way of beginning again. Stories like this remind us that the loudest moments in life aren't always the ones that change us the most. Sometimes it's the quiet decision, the moment someone chooses dignity over anger, clarity over chaos. When trust breaks, the instinct is often to fight to prove a point to win. But as we've seen tonight, real strength can look surprisingly calm. It can look like walking away, closing a chapter, and letting the truth stand on its own. In the end, none of us really know what storms another person is carrying behind closed doors. That's why stories like these matter. They remind us that life is rarely simple, and people are rarely only heroes or villains. Or, what matters most is how we choose to move forward once the truth finally comes into the light, and how we hold on to our sense of self when everything else shifts. If this story stayed with you tonight, you're always welcome to be part of this little listening corner. Subscribing simply means you'll be here when the next story unfolds. And if you feel like sharing, you can leave a few lines in the comments about where you're listening from or what part of this story spoke to you the most. These conversations are often the most meaningful part of the journey. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wherever you are in the world tonight, take care of yourself. And we'll see you again soon for another story.